All right, so buckle up, everyone, because we are about to go deep, really deep on this one. Today, we're diving headfirst into Mencius Moldbug's Unqualified Reservations.
Of Moldbug.
Now,
Definitely.
it's not exactly a household name,
Not really.
but this guy, he's a political thinker, and let me tell you, he's throwing out some seriously radical ideas.
Yeah.
Stuff that really makes you question a lot of what we tend to take for granted.
What I find so interesting about Moldbug is that he doesn't just kind of sit back and critique the system. I mean, he does that, of course, but he goes further. He offers up a whole different blueprint for society. He calls it the new structure. And it's rooted in some really radically different interpretations of history and power.
And one of the things in this book that just blew my mind was the way he flips the script on the American Revolution.
Totally.
He goes all the way back to the primary sources and argues that, well, it wasn't this clear-cut victory for freedom and justice that, we're often taught in school.
He's got a point. He points to guys like Peter Oliver,
right?
A loyalist who saw the revolution not as this noble fight for liberty, but almost like this messy power grab between different factions.
A power struggle.
Yeah, and this challenge to how we normally look at the revolution is so key to getting Moldbug's whole critique of the modern political system.
So okay.
Yeah.
If the American Revolution wasn't like the shining beacon of democracy, where did things go wrong? This is where the cathedral comes in, right?
Bingo. The cathedral. It's Moldbug's term for this kind of interconnected web of universities, media, and government that he sees as this, force that shapes public opinion and policy. And it does it in a way that just shuts down any voices that, try to disagree.
So it's think about it. You go to university, you read the news, you get into those heated political debates online, and there's this set of assumptions and beliefs that just keeps getting reinforced, even if you don't realize it's happening.
Yeah, and he's saying these institutions, instead of being these places for open debate where you can explore tons of different ideas, they actually work more like, churches. They're promoting one specific ideology.
That's exactly the comparison he makes. He calls it a scientific theocracy, the system that just, keeps itself going. The same ideas just get recycled and reinforced over and over again.
And that's why he thinks it's so hard to challenge the status quo, even when the evidence is right there in front of you showing that things aren't working.
Okay, now I see how this ties back to his view of the American Revolution. If the revolution didn't really change the power structures underneath, maybe the cathedral is just a continuation of that, you know, just in a different form. It's pretty trippy when you think about it.
And this leads to Moldbug's critique of specific areas of policy. He sees the cathedral's fingerprints all over things like climate change, economics, even the way we think about intelligence and equality.
So let's unpack those areas one by one. Starting with climate change, he's pretty skeptical of the way that the science is used, right, to push for certain political agendas.
Oh, absolutely. Moldbug, he questions whether there's really a consensus on climate change. And he thinks the science is often presented in a way that blocks any kind of debate. He's especially critical of guys like Professor James Hansen.
Yeah, Hansen.
This leading climate scientist.
That's vocal.
Yeah, and he's really pushing for major government intervention, to fight climate change. And Moldbug suggests that scientists like Hansen, who everyone sees as these objective truth seekers, are actually way too crazy with the government. They're pushing for their own political agendas.
That's a big accusation.
It is, yeah.
But he doesn't stop there, right? He also says that, a lot of climate science isn't really falsifiable. So even if new evidence came out that contradicts the main narrative, people wouldn't accept it.
He uses the work of Steve McIntyre.
Right, McIntyre.
Who's this guy who challenged some of the statistical methods used in some big climate change research to show what he means. Moldbug believes that real science has to be open to the possibility of being wrong. If evidence that goes against a theory is ignored or dismissed, then it's not real science.
Interesting. And it seems like he's applying that same logic to economics, too. He's not a fan of Keynesian economics, which is pretty much the main economic theory these days, right?
Keynesian economics, yeah, it's all about government spending to, stimulate the economy, especially when things are going bad.
During recessions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Moldbug, he sees that as a way for politicians to manipulate the economy for their own gain. And it's often at the expense of long-term stability. He points out how things like deficit spending and printing more money, they just lead to inflation, which hurts regular people the most.
He makes this crazy comparison, I remember, between Keynesian economics and drug addiction. It's like he's saying governments get addicted to that short-term boost from these policies, even if it creates huge problems down the line.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Right.
He argues that this creates like this boom and bust cycle, and each time there's a bust, the government steps in with more spending, and that just leads to like more instability. It's a very different perspective from what we usually hear.
Okay, so climate change, economics. But Moldbug doesn't stop there. He also gets into some pretty controversial stuff with his ideas about human intelligence and equality. This concept of human neurological uniformity, or HNU.
Oh, H&U.
Yeah.
This is where his thinking goes against the grain, big time. He doesn't buy the idea that all people are inherently equal when it comes to their cognitive ability. He argues that those differences, they have real-world effects on how we should think about social policy and inequality.
So, like, he uses this analogy of nobles and commoners,
Because,
to show his point.
He's saying some people are just naturally predisposed to be leaders, and if we ignore those differences, it could lead to some pretty bad outcomes.
It's definitely a thought-provoking idea, and I can see how it could be, like, interpreted in a lot of different ways.
Sure.
But before we get too deep into that, I think it's key to understand what Moldbug is actually suggesting as the alternative. He lays out this vision for a new structure, right?
He does. And to understand that, we've got to shift how we think about how societies are, organized in the first place. Imagine like a system that's more like a corporation. You've got a clear chain of command. Everyone's focused on being competent and efficient. And there's a leader, kind of like a CEO, who's responsible for, getting results. That's basically Moldbug's new structure.
So instead of those messy and often really inefficient systems we have now with all their checks and balances and like divided authority, he's saying we need something much more streamlined and centralized.
Yeah.
It's like he's arguing that our current systems are outdated. We need an upgrade to something that can handle the complexities of the modern world.
He thinks the modern structure, with all its emphasis on democracy and individual rights, it's become way too vulnerable to corruption, to gridlock, even to the tyranny of the majority.
Right, yeah.
He thinks a system modeled after a joint stock republic with a clear hierarchy and a focus on competence, that'd be way more effective.
Okay, I'm getting the picture.
Yeah.
But how do we actually get from where we are now to this new structure? He talks about a mandate of heaven, which sounds pretty, abstract.
It does sound a bit out there, yeah.
Right.
But he actually lays out a concrete path for getting there. It all starts with what he calls the 3 steps. And the first step, it's all about personal transformation.
Oh, right. Become worthy. It sounds almost like spiritual.
It kind of does, yeah. He really emphasizes personal development and like rejecting that whole idea of chasing power for its own sake.
Like, don't be power hungry.
Exactly. It's all about developing the right mindset and character before you even try to change the world.
Okay, so step 1, become worthy. What's next in this journey toward Moldbug's new structure?
Well, this is where things get even more interesting. So we were talking about the first step in Moldbug's plan, right? Become worthy. It's all about like really changing yourself first. It challenges that whole go out and change the system idea you hear all the time.
Yeah, it's like he's saying real change has to start with each of us individually. But once you've like done that work on yourself, what's next? How do you build this new structure?
Well, step 2 is where it gets really interesting. It's about creating alternatives to all those institutions that Moldbug sees as, part of the problem. He calls this step build the antiversity and the plinth.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. What exactly is an antiversity?
Remember how Moldbug says universities are part of the cathedral? Like they're just pushing one ideology?
Right.
Well, the antiversity is his answer to that. It's like a whole new kind of school, dedicated to real intellectual freedom. A place where you can actually explore different ideas, free from the cathedral's dogma.
So it's like creating this parallel system, a place where ideas that challenge the status quo can actually be explored and debated openly. Makes sense. But what about this plinth? It sounds kind of mysterious.
It's not really a secret society or anything, but it is a very particular group of people. Moldbug sees the plinth as being made up of folks who are super educated and also deeply committed to the new structure.
I see.
They're the ones who are going to like drive the movement forward, lay the foundation for this new society and lead the transition.
So it's like a mix of intellectuals and activists, a group that can both explain the vision of the new structure and then actually make it happen.
Yeah.
But how do they do that? How do you go from talking about change to actually doing it? That's step 3, right? Rule point one.
Yeah, Moldbug's not shy about the end goal. Step 3 is all about taking power and actually implementing the new structure. He thinks that once you've got those first 2 steps in place, once you've got enough people who are worthy and you've built up these alternative institutions, then the transition can happen pretty smoothly.
So it's not about some violent revolution or anything like that.
No, not at all.
It's more about, like, creating a system that's just so much better, so much more effective that people naturally want to be a part of it.
Exactly, like a peaceful transfer of power, because the new system is just obviously superior.
Okay, I like it. But how does that actually work?
Well, Moldbug argues that the current system, the modern structure, it's just not sustainable. He thinks it's losing its mandate of heaven, which is how he describes, like, the legitimacy of a governing system.
Wait, hold on. Mandate of heaven? That sounds kind of mystical.
It's a term that comes from Chinese philosophy, but Moldbug uses it in a more practical way. He's basically saying that any government, to be successful, needs to be able to solve problems and deliver results for the people. And when it can't do that anymore, it loses its legitimacy. It loses its mandate of heaven.
I see. So he's saying that the modern structure, with all its bureaucracy and corruption and short-term thinking, it's failing to deliver.
Right. And as it declines, the new structure, which is focused on competence and efficiency and getting things done, it's ready to step in and fill the void.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see how this all fits together. So by cultivating worthiness, building alternative institutions, and being ready to take charge when the time is right, the plinth can basically guide this transition to the new structure, make it smoother, less chaotic.
Exactly. And this brings us back to some of the specific areas where Moldbug sees the cathedral having a huge impact. We talked about climate change and economics, but there's so much more to unpack there. Let's start with his take on the financial system. He's got some pretty radical ideas there.
Oh yeah, he does. Like, remember how he criticizes Keynesian economics and how it creates that cycle of government intervention and instability?
Yeah.
Well, his solution is pretty extreme. He actually thinks we should nationalize all financial assets.
I know, right? Nationalize everything. It's a huge idea, even for Moldbug.
But what's the logic behind that?
He sees it as a way to basically reset the whole financial system. He thinks the current system is just so messed up with all the debt and speculation and, bad incentives that it can't be fixed. So by having the government take over all financial assets, we can start fresh, wipe out the existing problems, and build a more stable and fair system from scratch.
Okay, it's definitely a bold proposal. But let's shift gears for a minute and talk about human neurological uniformity, or HNU. This is one of his most controversial ideas, right? He's basically saying that the whole idea of everyone being intellectually equal is a myth.
It is a controversial idea. It goes against a lot of modern thinking about equality. Moldbug argues that ignoring these differences in cognitive ability actually leads to bad social policies. He thinks that if we recognize these differences and structure society accordingly, we actually get better outcomes for everyone.
But isn't that dangerous? I mean, couldn't this kind of thinking be used to justify discrimination and create social hierarchies?
It's a valid concern, and Moldbug tries to address it. He says he's not trying to create rigid social divisions or justify oppression or anything like that.
Okay, but then what is he saying?
He's saying we need to recognize reality. Different people have different strengths and weaknesses, and ignoring that can actually be harmful. It can lead to policies that just don't work or even make things worse.
So it's not about saying some people are better than others. It's about recognizing that we're all different and building systems that take those differences into account.
Exactly. He sees the cathedral as promoting this unrealistic view of human equality, which he thinks blinds them to how people actually are. And that leads to all sorts of problems.
It's definitely a complex and controversial idea. It raises a lot of ethical questions. But I think it's important to understand where he's coming from, even if we don't agree with everything he says.
I agree. It helps us see things from a different perspective and consider alternatives to those dominant narratives we hear all the time.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. From Moldbug's critique of the American Revolution to his vision for a new structure, from his radical economic ideas to his controversial views on human intelligence. But there's one more piece I want to explore, his Universal Peace Plan.
Yes, the UPP. It's a fascinating thought experiment, really shows how Moldbug approaches problem solving, always looking for more rational and effective ways to organize society.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about this Universal Peace Plan. What is it all about?
Well, it's kind of like he wants to bring some order to the chaos, you know? The UPP is like this framework for settling international disputes, but it's all based on property rights and who has the authority to do what.
So instead of all the wars and the backroom deals and the political posturing, he's saying we should treat international disputes like legal cases.
Exactly. It's like imagine two countries are, butting heads. The UPP basically asks, would both sides be willing to let someone else, like a neutral third party, decide who's right, based on rules they agreed to beforehand? No. If they both say yes, great. You can probably resolve things peacefully and fairly.
Right.
But if one side's like, nope, not doing that, well, that kind of tells you they're not really interested in playing fair. They might be the one picking the fight.
It's like taking all the emotion and ideology out of it, right?
Totally.
And just applying like a clear, objective standard. But is that even possible? Countries rarely seem to act rationally, especially when it comes to stuff like national pride or territory.
I mean, Moldbug knows the UPP is more of a thought experiment. He's not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but he uses it to show, the problems with how things work now, how power politics and everyone looking out for themselves, it just overrides any sense of fairness or justice.
And he uses the UPP to, analyze historical context, right? Sure. I remember him talking about the American Civil War.
Yeah. And his take on that is, really interesting.
It is.
He says the South, even though they were, defending slavery, they were actually the ones who had been more open to letting someone else decide the issue.
So in a way, they were the defendants in the conflict.
Yeah, kinda. And he suggests that the North, by refusing to compromise, well, they basically started the war.
It's definitely a different way of looking at it. He even talks about James Buchanan, right?
Buchanan, yeah.
The president before Lincoln.
Who was really trying to avoid war, trying to negotiate and find some compromise.
Exactly. So Moldbug's point is that, if they had this more rational, principled way to handle conflicts, like the UPP, maybe they could have avoided all that bloodshed.
It's a big what if, you know?
Yeah.
But it gets you thinking.
It does. So even if the UPP isn't a real world solution, it's a really powerful critique of how things are and a glimpse at how they could be different.
And that's what's so great about Moldbug. He's not just complaining about things. He's got ideas. He's a visionary. He wants a world that's governed by reason, where people are competent, and we understand how humans actually are.
It's a vision that's, inspiring and a little bit scary at the same time. It makes you think about some uncomfortable things, about ourselves and the systems we've built.
But that's why it's good to engage with these ideas. Moldbug makes us think differently, question the stuff we usually take for granted, and consider that maybe, just maybe, there are better ways to do things.
So we've covered a lot with Mencius Moldbug's Unqualified Reservations. We've looked at his critiques, his vision, his solutions. What's the takeaway here? Should we all become Moldbugians now?
I don't think it's about, following everything he says blindly. But there's something to be said for really engaging with his work, even if it makes you a little uneasy. He's pushing us to think critically, question the narratives we're bombarded with, and consider that there might be other and maybe better ways to organize society.
He definitely throws down the gauntlet, right? If the modern structure really is on its way out, as Moldbug says, what comes next? Is it his new structure or something totally different? These are questions we all got to wrestle with.
Exactly. Moldbug's work is a starting point. It's a jumping off point for some really deep thinking. It's on each of us to figure out what we believe and what kind of future we want to build.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Mencius Moldbug. It's been a trip, and we hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, keep your minds open and those questions coming.